Hey English teachers, so you want to study a film in your English class as a piece of literature. Where do you start and how do you go through this? How do you go about it? Let's have a quick look. Okie dokie, so the first thing to remember when you are studying a film as a piece of literature is to treat it as a piece of literature, just as you would a novel study or a short story study. So you'll be looking at things like the characters, development, relationships and so on, the setting and the effect of that, the key moments and the ideas, exactly the same as you would in a novel study. You'll also be looking at language features. However, those language features are the film techniques, and we'll look at those a bit later on. So that's the only real difference. Now, just as you would with a novel, you would watch the film first yourself, and then if you've got time, watch it again, but this time make a note of the key scenes. Now with those notes, and it is a bit of stop starting, it can be a bit painful, but make a note of the timestamps. So a lot of us buy our movies now from YouTube. Make a note of the timestamps that align with each of those key scenes, because that is going to save you a hell of a lot of time later on when you're trying to find those key scenes. So that would be my first tip. Right, so I'm going to go through a list of steps that you could go through with your classes, but you don't have to do them in this order, but this is one way, all right? So step one is I would teach film techniques first. It seems a bit funny doing this out of context, but I think what we are not doing so much of now is we are not giving students these notes that provide them with a point of reference later on for things like activities, essays, and so on. So if you can give them notes on film techniques to refer to later on, then that's going to be gold. So some of the things that you can go over, and I've listed them in my blog, which I'll link below. Shot sizes, camera angles, camera movements, lighting, costume, and so on. Mise en scène, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but never mind. Sound, obviously, things like that. So I would go through those things. One of the activities that I used to do with my classes, and this is before phones were banned in schools, of course, was I would get the kids to take shots using the different shot sizes and camera angles in particular on their phones, and then they would caption them. And the cool thing about that was that they learned them because they were doing them, but also they, in my wildest dreams, they could sit at the bus stop and flip through their phones and learn those camera techniques. But it worked really well. Now I think maybe you could do that as a homework activity and either get them to upload that to a Google Doc or something like that, or Google Slide, or if you can have a sneaky look at their phones in class, then maybe do that. But that's one activity. I've got it in my blog. Manipulation of time is another one as well that you can have a look at. You know, the fast accelerated motion, the slow motion, flashbacks and long and short takes and so on, the cutaway shots, things like that. So that's a good, I'm just looking at my blog as reference here. Those are good little things there. If you do want to hang those, then hang those techniques on an example film. I strongly recommend you use Falling Sparrows, and people will be sick of me going on about this movie, but honestly, Falling Sparrows, it's 12 minutes long. It's available free online through the New Zealand Film Commission. It's linked in my blog, and it has just about every film technique you could ever hope for. Plus, it's got a rocking little story that's great to discuss. So if you wanted to have a little, spot the film technique activity, you could play that film and kids could use your reference notes to find those techniques. So that might be quite cool as well. Okay, step 2, the next thing I would do would be to give students some background information on your film. For example, Gattaca. You could look into things like genetic engineering, prejudice in our society, ex machina. You could look at obviously AI and how that's coming along in the world. And Blood Diamond, I love that film because it's about fair trade. You can look at the Kimberley Agreement and so on. Uproar, the latest film that I've looked at, you can look at the South Africa's apartheid system, you can look at the New Zealand land confiscations, and of course the 1981 Springbok tour to New Zealand. So all of that background information is really valuable so that the kids have, students have that context to hang the film on. So they haven't watched it yet, but they are getting that background information. Step 3, the favorite step, you get a couple of periods to sit back and watch the movie, uninterrupted, except by the bell for the next period, just to enjoy the movie. So the students get to watch it, enjoy it, understand it, without teacher talk, interruptions. I always like to get students to bring along popcorn, make it like a fun movie thing, like let them eat in class, all of that kind of thing. Bit of a festival, movie, happy days. Rightio, step 4. Now remember I talked to you before about creating that summary, that list of scenes that you timestamp when you first watch the movie on your own. Now take that list and identify those key scenes. Those are the ones that you will want to analyze with your class. Now, what I like to do is I do 1 or 2 pages where I put in some screenshots, maybe I'll put in film techniques, maybe a few notes, maybe I'll get the students to annotate my page of screenshots themselves. It depends on time, depends on the type of class and what I'm wanting to do with it. But definitely create those little worksheets. They are gold. And again, if they're annotating, I'm all for pen and paper. So what are they going to do with those? I would focus on, find 2 techniques, and you'll see why in a minute. So concentrate on one technique first, and then get the students to name that technique, describe the example. And I always say to students, okay, so you're writing it down, you're describing this technique in the shot or in the scene, and describe it well enough for, I used to say, for a blind person to imagine. So, or anyone who has not seen the film should be able to imagine the shot or the scene. So that's describing it well then. The next step in analysing the shot or the scene would be to explain the effect of that key technique they're looking at. Now, you've got to make sure that they are discussing the technique in relation to that extract from the movie, not the technique itself, because same thing with close reading. What do? Say they're so explaining the effect of a metaphor in close reading. And they'll say, a metaphor compares 2 things. They're not explaining the effect of it in this example. And they do the same thing with film. So make sure they are, I sort of go down the track of explain the effect of the example rather than explain the effect of the technique. It's just all in the wording of it. From there, they can explain how another technique works in well with this one. So then they get that holistic idea of how idea is created in this scene. So because they're looking at how different techniques work together. For example, the body language of a character with the music, the background music, the extreme close-up of the tearful eye with the dialogue, you're dumped. Things like that. So that's a really important skill. The other thing, that the next stage would be stepping outside the text. So you're looking at how this scene, this shot helps illustrate ideas about human behavior, human nature, whatever you want to call it, but also the wider world, those past events, the current trends, or our possible future. So that's the wider world stuff. And finally, you'll be looking at the director, I almost said author, the director's purpose. So you put all that together and say, okay, so what is the director wanting us to do? So remember, talking about ideas, that wider world stuff, they're saying the idea that, use the word that forces them to write things as a sentence. And when you're talking about purpose, it's the purpose is to. So to is the word of the day there. Same thing with written texts. So now you've got your scene studies, or maybe just a few shot studies as well. Now they form your evidence for studying your film as a piece of literature. So this is step 5. You're looking at it as a piece of literature now. So that means studying the characters, their development, their change, their conflict. It means studying the setting and how that influences events and characters, ideas, symbolism, and so on. The evidence is all there in those scene studies, as I said. So you'll be familiar with that. As an English teacher, you know how to do that because you've done it with novels and short stories and poetry and so on. So you're in your safe zone now. Okay, so now you've got to your end point. How are you going to get students to process the information that they've learned to prove that they understand the film as a piece of literature? Now, just as you were able to go into teaching this film as literature, looking at the characters, looking at the setting and so on, because you had all of that evidence from your scene studies and scene analyses, the same thing applies for when the students go into those final activities. So you could have students writing a response, a personal response, or a review, or an essay, a literary essay. They've got all that evidence from those studies. So happy days there. Now, I always used to say to students, you've got to add a film technique and a quotation from the film in every paragraph. Obviously, quotations come from narration or from dialogue. That's film techniques. They are film techniques. However, I found it easier, students understood better if I separated that out. So a film technique and a quotation. So that's one way around that. So enjoy your film studies, and just remember it's just as you would a novel. However, your film techniques are your language techniques.